That's right, and then I can stay up here.
Hello? Okay.
chairs, because that gives it, that's where we put it. That's better. That's good.
I think it knocks out. You got this.
Let's see.
A couple here.
Hello, welcome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to St. Matthew's. My name is Kelly Kirby, and I think that it is very good that you are here tonight. I'm blessed to serve as the rector of this community. Our speaker is here thanks to an incredible grant funding vocation and calling. We've made a theological claim that all callings from God bend this world toward justice. So you can listen and see if you can agree with that claim. You are invited to stay for the book signing reception at the conclusion of this program. And I'd like to invite up Robin McNally, who is a member of this congregation and on our Creation Care Committee. She will introduce our speaker.
Well, I add to Kelly's welcome. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here. We appreciate your interest, and we're just delighted that you're here to share with us and welcoming Dr. Tallamy to our community. How many of you in here have read at least one of Dr. Tallamy's books? Yeah, this is a learned community. One of the things that I think is most important, and most all of you already know because you've read it, and for those of you who don't know, I think it's fair to say that Dr. Tallamy is the architect of the homegrown national park, of which you can create in your own backyard. He has been teaching us through his research, truly, and through his many, many works, that we can be the best possible stewards of our own land by simply engaging in a few best practices of cultivating native plants that also then draw on natural insects, attracts the birds, attracts the butterflies and moths and various other animals. And through that, one of the things that we will notice is that the sun, together with these plants and all of these insects, grow the most beautiful gardens, and we're also contributing largely to our own environmental justice and our own environment in the community. One of the things that many of you all probably know already or already assume is that Dr. Tallamy has authored close to 100 research articles, and that's a very specialized skill. When you're a technical writer, when you have to analyze data, and you're in peer-reviewed journals, that says a lot about the quality of your writing. But I don't know about you, but for me, Dr. Tallamy writes in a very conversational, very descriptive way. In every paragraph, wants you to keep on reading and reading and reading. So he's masterful not only at analyzing data, but also making it, translating it so that it is commutable to us and that we can take it in our everyday lives and make it to work for us. So he is going to share with us an unbelievable world in which he lives and works and enjoys, and we appreciate all of his great work and how he's really transforming us. But Dr. Tallamy, I want to tell you a few things about us here in Louisville. As you've already noticed, this is a very curious community. Everybody here has read your book. Everybody here is very interested, and each of these people probably touch a number of other people and influence them. So I've lived in Kentucky almost all of my life, but I didn't live in Louisville until the last 4 years. But I always admired the curiosity and the desire to learn and to be better and to do more. And so that's who we are as a community. And that's one of the reasons why Kelly wrote this grant and we were able to get you here, because we are curious and we do want to learn, and we're so very grateful. St. Matthew's in Louisville, will you please welcome Dr. Tallamy?
Well, gee, that's a great introduction. Very complete. Does anybody have any questions? We actually have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to dive right in. I want to tell you what my idea of nature's best hope is, and I'll give you a spoiler. You are nature's best hope. So I'm really going to tell you why I think that's the case. Before we do that, though, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope was. He, of course, very famous professor at Harvard. He died the day after Christmas 2 years ago, and it was a terrible loss to the world of conservation because he spent most of his 60-year career trying to save life on planet Earth. Not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. In 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and he had one simple message. If we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, which sounds like a good idea, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it's going to disappear everywhere. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a great idea. We just put everything that's in trouble in that half, and we humans be in the other half, and we'll all live together. It'd be great. Problem is, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. And the other half has 8 billion people with all of our airports and hardscape and detritus. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So a lot of people are wondering how we can actually do this. And that's basically what I want to talk about tonight. I do think we can realize E.O. Wilson's dream, but we need a new approach to conservation to be able to do that. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about what happened in 2019, at least on the East Coast. It was pretty wide and kind of happening again this year, having a big oak mast. Members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time, and that's what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. But I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there, and then it forced its entire body through that little hole. It was a tight squeeze. And once it's out of the acorn, it's a very dangerous time because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. It takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly stays in that underground chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do. But that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down there at the end of that extension. And they take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in it, and that's how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the next year the way most insects would? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole, kind of like a true vacuum. You know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she's filled it with 3 species of Temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the hole made by acorn weevils after they have left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody, it's time to move, time to grab the larvae, grab the eggs, move the entire colony into the new acorn. That takes about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard there, make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until that acorn falls apart. So what's my point with this little story? That's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between insects and between animals and plants, that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn and they'll fly up to a mile, sometimes 1.5 miles from the parent tree. Then they tap it below the surface of the soil. And the object is they're going to go back and have something to eat in the wintertime. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. And a single jay can bury up to 4,500 acorns each fall. Specialized interaction between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena faciliae, unless you have Facilia. That is the only plant, the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is really important in our native bees. We've got between 3,600 and 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. I could talk all night, all week, all year about nature-specialized relationships. The point I want to make today, though, is that most of these relationships today are in trouble. As a matter of fact, nature is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave most of the country as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states. It's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And those are typically mountaintops. And that's because we've logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We have grazed it. Got 770 million acres of rangeland out there. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas dedicated to cattle. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. You could spell that any way you want. We polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves, and each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need, because it is nature, it is natural systems that keeps us alive on this planet. So why have we done this? I don't know. But I suspect we thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population, already gone. Now, the UN is predicting that we'll lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And they made that prediction 2 years ago, so I guess it's the next 18 years now. It's a prediction, but it's one we have to make sure it does not come to pass, because those are the species that keep us alive on this planet. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and as Shakespeare would say, upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk's about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me, but those efforts deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline, the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if Earth lost its insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals, those food webs would collapse and all those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot, because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are totally dependent on the life support that ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. These are just a few things that plants do every day that we depend on every day, like produce oxygen, like clean our water, slow its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use, carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and through photosynthesis, they're building their tissues out of that carbon, and then they pump the extra carbon that they fix into the ground through their root systems. 40% of the carbon that plants fix ends up in the soil, where it becomes extremely stable as long as the soil is not turned over. Plants are building topsoil, they're holding it in place, they're preventing floods, they're dampening severe weather, they're converting sunlight into food. If we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight, and I will get hungry. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8 billion people that are demanding more and more ecosystem services every day. Now, we do have parks and we do have preserves, and they're doing the best they can, but we are already in the 6th great extinction event that the planet has ever experienced, which means it's not good enough. The simple solution now is to start practicing conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like that. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. And one of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups who have been good at doing that, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We typically go to a place, take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking it, going to another place, doing the same thing. Not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we were capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together, we cannot coexist in the same place at the same time, that notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still around in our own culture today. He may not have recognized it as an option. What I want to argue this evening, though, is that not only is living in nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there were not a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And that means we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, back to private property. Most of the country's privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. And of course, we can't afford to fail. When I use the word conservation, I'm not using it exactly the way I mean. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left out there. That has been our conservation model for the last century, and we certainly want to keep doing that. But it's obviously not good enough, so we have to go beyond conservation and move into restoration. We've got to rebuild natural systems in many or all of the places that we have destroyed them. And you will hear people say, well, there's no way you can put it back together again exactly the way it was. And they're probably right. We've changed too many things. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions to create functioning ecosystems again, even if it's not exactly what was on that space at some point in the past. But in order to do that, we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally, so we have to start with the most powerful groups. And there's two groups we cannot do without. One is the flowering plants. And of course, the pollinators allow those plants to reproduce. They're capturing energy from the sun, and through photosynthesis, turning it into simple sugars and carbohydrates, which is the food that supports just about all the animal life on the planet. So now we have the food that all the animals need locked up in plant tissues, mostly leaves. If you don't get that food to animals, you don't have any animals. And if you don't have any animals, you don't have a functioning ecosystem. Well, it turns out that most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate those plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, and not just any insect. Caterpillars turn out to be enormously important. They are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That is the chickadee that I have at our house in southeast Pennsylvania. You probably have the black cat chickadee here, but you might have the Carolina. They're practically the same bird doing the same thing. One of the things they do is come to our feeders all winter long and eat our seeds, and we tend to think that's all chickadees need. But even in the wintertime, only 50% of a chickadee's diet is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. When it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they've got to give up seeds, and they turn to invertebrates. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not alone. They're not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. Thin wrapper is its exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because the caterpillars are soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Beaks like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. So some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and many beetles have really sharp edges too. And finally, it turns out that the caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate. You're a vertebrate. Birds are vertebrates. And we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? Well, from what they're eating, particularly during the breeding season, what they bring back to the nest. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among bird prey items. These first two bars over here on the left are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. The butterfly down there, that's the adult caterpillars, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids than the caterpillars because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And way over there on the right is the earthworm. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? And this is a really important question. In other words, how many caterpillars do we have to make on our landscapes to have birds? Well, let's go back to Carolina chickadee. There's a lot of data on Carolina chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make one nest of Carolina chickadees? Is one or two enough? Or one or two a day enough? Well, no. One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees, depending on the number of chicks in the nest, to the point where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. They're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count them. But you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make one clutch of a bird that's a third of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you've got to have all those caterpillars in your yard because the birds only forage about 50 meters from the nest. And that's true for most of the birds out there. They're foraging very close to the nest. They are not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not contain all of those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of the bird declines that we're measuring out there. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al., that's the Smithsonian group, who said we've lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups. The species that require insects, the bar on the left there, particularly when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects when they're breeding. So things like doves and finches and crossbills can actually make a little milk out of the seeds that they eat, and that's what they rear their young on. They don't need any insects. And look, they didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years. But the species that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take caterpillars away, as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. And it's not just birds that require caterpillars. This is an ornate box turtle. You may have a few around here. A little more common farther west. Actually, not common at all now. They used to be very common in the Midwest. They used to follow cutworm and armyworm populations around and eat hundreds of caterpillars a day. So lots of things depend on caterpillars, which means we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing, be pretty. Now we're going to ask them to do 2 things, be pretty and ecologically functional. And that's not going to happen unless we put the caterpillars back. So how do you add caterpillars to landscapes? You add caterpillars by adding the plants that support those caterpillars. It seems pretty straightforward, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about it. We have to choose the plants that do support a lot of caterpillars, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And I'm going to use the monarch butterfly as an example. You can have all the calorie pear and all the crepe myrtle and all the ginkgos and all the hostas and all the burning bush and all the privet, all the things we typically landscape with in our yards, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds, and that is called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists, just like the monarch. Why is that? Well, plants have made them specialized. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction, so they've loaded their tissues with nasty-tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And if you don't believe me, after this talk, go out and eat a plant. Forget the reception. Go out and eat a plant and see if you like it. You're not going to like it. It's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well defended. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know they're toxic. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists, just like the monarch. They can only eat plants for which they have very specialized adaptations. Specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of interacting with those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. So if you move into a new house, you take the milkweeds out of your yard and put in hostas, the monarch's not going to be able to start to make a living on hostas. Can't do it. It's locked into milkweed. So it has two choices then: fly away and find milkweed someplace else, or starve to death. Turns out there's three kinds of plants out there. There's plants that contribute energy to local food webs. So remember, they're capturing energy from the sun, turning it into food, and then they pass it on so that you have animals in your food web. Plants that are good at doing that, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that actively remove energy from local food webs. The very best example of a contributor in 84% of the counties in which they occur is one of the oaks. We have 91 species of oaks, and they pass on more energy to other creatures than any other type of plant. A good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo, and I know you have a wonderful ginkgo out here. This is just an example. It is a beautiful tree, it has great fall color, but nothing eats a ginkgo, so it's not passing on any energy. And a good example of a detractor would be calorie pear. Actually, driving in here, the whole rows of them on the street there. Bradford pear, you might notice Bradford pear. Not only do they not pass on their energy, but they escape into our natural areas. They become serious invasive species, pushing out the contributors, the native plants that do support the food webs. So all I'm saying here is that plant choice matters. If we're going to restore ecosystem function, you've got to have viable food webs, and that's not going to happen if we don't plant the right plants. And I'm going to give you an example of how well it works when we do choose the right plants. And I'm going to start with my house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. My wife wants me to call it our house. Yeah, we both moved in there the year 2000. It was a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots, and it was a very old farm. Been farmed almost 300 years. Soil was exhausted. Most of it had already washed down into a little low area we have. The last thing they did was to mow it for hay. So there were very few plants there too, except for all the invasives that came back. So our job was to try to put this back together again, and we'd never done that before. I did know that I wanted to see how many caterpillars we could get to make a living at our house, but I'd never done that before either. And the first one I tried was the Canadian owlet. It's a pretty little thing. I'd never seen a Canadian owlet. That's what the adult looks like. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets on your property unless you have their host plant, meadow rue. We didn't have any meadow rue. We didn't have much of anything. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace, and I planted them, and they grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very, very little faith that Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for at least 2 months after I planted it. Then I was walking by for another reason. I looked over. It was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I am still impressed with that. So now we've got a good population of Canadian owlets and meadow rue. We've added 2 species to that depauperate landscape. The restoration has begun. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That beautiful moth has actually nothing to do with goldenrod. That's a misnomer. It's a specialist on that plant, Biden's Aristosa ditch daisy. We didn't have any Bidens aristosa, but I did know where there was some Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, I planted them at home. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, last year they took over my front yard. That's okay. Well, I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of Bidens, but they did, and now we've got a good population of both of those. So now we've added 4 species. Want to see if I get the hackberry emperor to make a living at our house, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that ought to occur in our yard. But like its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I planted a couple of hackberry trees, had to wait 4 years for the hackberry emperor to find my hackberry, but they did, and now we've added 6 species to the property, and that's how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own. And along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. There are 110 species of caterpillars that develop on goldenrod in the mid-Atlantic states. I planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I hear some people don't like it. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It's a good ground cover. It climbs our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It makes valuable berries for the birds in the fall. And by valuable, I mean they are high in fat. That's what our migrating birds need, is a source of fat that fuels the migration. And it's what our overwintering birds need because they need the fat to make it through the winter. And those berries come from tiny little inconspicuous flowers. You don't even know Virginia creeper is in bloom until you see this big cloud of native bees around it. Turns out it's a wonderful pollinator plant. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not real showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant of the large sphinx moth caterpillars that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. I want to see if I get the evening primrose moth to make a living at our house, because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted that. The moth did come, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded in there, but it's always very cute. And I planted lots of oak trees. These are just examples of the plants that we have put back on our property. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, well, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. If you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right. You won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak contributes to your local food web, remember that's a new goal now, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to call in the moths that make the caterpillars that run the food web at our house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the hesitant dagger moth, the medium dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves. And people say, oh, it's going to kill the pin oak. No, ovenbird's going to come eat that caterpillar in the next 5 minutes. You do not have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to contribute to the life around you. It will contribute right away. Is this what our house looks like, taken from the same place I took that first picture? Just to show you, we put some plants back. Not all of them. We're still working on it. But my research has shown over the decades, actually, that if you know the number of species of moths in your local food web, moths, not butterflies. Butterflies are bad-tasting, day-flying moths. And because they're bad-tasting, they don't actually add a lot to local food webs. So you count the number of moth species, you have a very good index of the stability of that food web and the productivity, the number of other species it's going to support. So 6 years ago, I started the big job of trying to count all the moths that occur in our house by taking a picture of them. I have to have a picture of them. I am still at it, but I'm up to 1,256 species of moths that are at our house because we put the plants back. Now, we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania's 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the landmass, we have 48% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we have recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline that we see all the time. The World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. It's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I'm convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We really could turn headlines like this around. But we do have 10 acres. People say, well, gee, I don't have that much land. Will it work on smaller properties? That's a very good question. So let's consider a house in suburbia. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres. 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development. When they moved in, their yard was choked with bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle, another serious invasive. So they got rid of that. Then they planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature that they call a bubbler, and then they started to count the birds that are using their yard. And they are up to 149 bird species so far, including 35 warbler species, an incredible number. Just to compare that to our house, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Yes, it does. How about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. Her property abuts O'Hare Airport. She has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's not connected to any natural area at all. So she's a little island in the middle of Chicago. It's a pretty island because Pam is a native plant landscaper and she knows how to do it. But it is an isolated island. She did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, little water feature, and then she sat back and she says, with a glass of wine, and started to count the birds using her yard. So I think it was more than one glass. And she's still at it. She's up to 125 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. All right, there's 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way, and we do want to succeed in a big way, and one of those is to address that big lawn issue we've got there. Last figure I've seen is 44 million acres of lawn in this country, which is an area bigger than New England, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Now, we know why we do this. It's a status symbol, and we have to display, oh, wait a minute. I drove by this church in Mississippi, actually several times. And I figured, geez, everybody's inside worshiping God's creations, and on the outside, they're killing them all, which doesn't make sense. So we need lawns for it because it's a status symbol, and we have to display our Halloween decorations for sure. But what if we replant half the area in lawn? We're not going to get rid of it. It's a wonderful cue for care, wonderful place to walk. But let's cut the area in half. Let's take areas like this and turn them into this. I got this picture from Dan Getman. I've never met Dan, but he said, look, I've got this big lawn. I'm putting plants in. So he sent me this picture. Okay, that's what we want to do. We'll make the math simple. We say we've got 40 million acres. We're going to cut that in half. That gives us 20 million acres to restore right at home, which is enough to make a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park is going to be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? When you put some part of nature right where you live, you get the opportunity to interact with it. Form a relationship with it. Your own time and your own pace, all you have to do is go outside. Or maybe all you have to do is look out the window. You can avoid crowds. If you go to a real national park, there are 375 million people there with you last year. So I know what you're really going to interact with. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed no matter what pandemic comes down the pike or no matter how many times we shut down the government. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is important in terms of developing that personal, unique relationship with Mother Nature. It's not mediated by somebody else. And it's really important for our poor kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying. We get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour to a natural area, and they walk around for an hour. The teacher tells them not to touch anything. And then they get back on the bus and they go home, and that's their experience with the natural world. It's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. But if they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and form a relationship with it, get to know it, fall in love with it, alone, no parental supervision. They will come home again. When we hover over our kids, we are sending the message that this is dangerous stuff. You are not capable of interacting with nature. That's a terrible message to send to the future stewards of the planet. If they're afraid of being a steward, if they don't know what good stewardship is, if they don't love being a good steward, they're going to be lousy stewards. And we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they will learn to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives on Hawaii in a very modest patch of nature. It's a little piece of lawn with a hedge. But there are no lizards there. And when she learned that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt those lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you learn how to take care of that lizard. You learn how to be a good steward of that piece of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress, catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. If you can't see that, there's a lizard hanging from her nose. But yeah, she sent me this not too long ago. But I guarantee she's going to remember these experiences in Hawaii, and I guarantee it's going to help her be a good steward of the planet. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do it. Go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org. It is free. It is designed to get the message that everybody is responsible for good Earth stewardship, to get that message to go viral across the whole country. What you do is you register your location of your home and the amount of area you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to reduce the lawn a little bit. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree. Maybe you're going to remove an invasive species. Whatever you do, you put that area on the map, and then your little piece of your county lights up. And you get to see who else in your county is a member of Homegrown National Park. And again, the object is to get the entire country to light up. What are we asking? We are asking people to reduce the area of lawn. Lawn does not accomplish any of the ecological goals that our landscapes now need to start accomplishing. And we want to replace that lawn with the natives that do accomplish those goals. We want to remove invasive plants from our property. Most people do have invasive plants on their property, and they don't even know it. Remember, if 78% of the country is privately owned and everybody got rid of the invasives on their private property, we'd be 78% done. And if you're protecting any natural area, you want to keep doing that as well. What are our ecological products? They're important. There's a significant increase in biodiversity, and what's happened at our house in Oxford, Pennsylvania is a very good example. Nature's resilient. It really does come back when you give it a chance. Measurable reduction in invasive species. Again, if we get rid of them off our properties, we're mostly done. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Lawn is the very worst plant you can choose for carbon sequestration. So if you replace it with anything, you're going to help fight climate change. And you're also going to start to build viable habitats outside of parks and preserves. Every bit of conservation we do outside of a park is going to help conservation inside of the park. There are also important sociological products, national awareness, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are too, and what our roles in those solutions are. We are trying to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's essential. It's not there just for our entertainment. And because it's essential for everybody, everybody has the responsibility of sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And finally, we want to merge all of the existing conservation organizations like Audubon and National Wildlife Federation and Wild Ones and all the Land Conservancy onto one visual, that map. We've got this 30 by 30 initiative. We're going to save 30% of the world by 2030, 30% of the U.S. by 2030. That's not going to happen if we don't record conservation on private properties. And all these organizations are doing good conservation, but nobody's recording it. So we are going to shrink the lawn. We're going to join Homegrown National Park. What plants should we put in the spaces where we take lawn away? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. It's the stone in the middle of the Roman arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of that caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They're the support system. They're essential. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. What's the best keystone plant in the entire country? It is one of the oaks. Any of the oaks in the mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars compared to tulip trees. Say tulip tree, tulip poplar, excellent native plant, but it only supports 21. So there are enormous differences among our native plants. They support over 950 species nationwide. No other plant genus comes close to that. So how do you find out what the best plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the best woody plants and herbaceous plants in your county will pop up. So the old excuse is, I don't know what to plant. Yes, you do. Native Plant Finder, it will help you through it. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which is not the goal. Turn out that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines, and these are all the ways that lights are killing our insects, particularly those moths that create the caterpillars that run our food web. But to me, this is good news. We have got to stop insect decline and reverse it. We've already lost more than 45% of the insects on the planet. They are the little things that run the world. We've got to turn that around, and if we can turn that around by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. There are a lot of switches to flick, but there's a lot of us to flick those switches. But, I hear all the time, well, gee, I can't turn the light out over my barn, or I can't turn it out over my garage or my front porch because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you realize, the bad man does not come very often. And if you don't want to do that, even easier, take the white bulb out of your security bulb and put in a yellow bulb. Yellow incandescent, yellow LED. Insects are not attracted to yellow wavelengths. If we switched out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs, overnight we would save millions of insects. And if we use LEDs, we would save millions of dollars too. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to modify our light system. Then we're going to invite one of the mosquito foggers to come kill all of our insects. Booming business around the country. And they say it's okay because what we're fogging is a natural product. And it is. It's pyrethroids, which is the natural insecticide that the chrysanthemums came up with. It's industrial strength pyrethroids, but it is a natural product. But so is cyanide, so is ricin. There are a lot of nasty natural products out there, so I don't think that's a good argument. They also say it only kills mosquitoes. And I wish they were right about that, but it's not even close to being true. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with, which is all the insects, including our beloved monarch. The monarch is now red listed by the IUCN, lost about 96% of them at this point. That's the result of in case you can't see it, he's holding a pile of dead monarchs that were killed by mosquito fogger on the eastern shore of Maryland. It's happening all over the country. And of course, the pollinators are being killed as well. The interesting thing, the ironic thing is it doesn't control mosquitoes. We are doing this for nothing. Actually, it costs you a lot of money to do it for nothing. If you're going to control mosquitoes, you don't do it in the adult stage. You have to kill 90% of them to get good control. These guys kill between 10 and 50%, so they're not even close to getting good control. The real way to control mosquitoes is in the larval stage. And biocontrol is a great way to do it. You get a bucket and you fill it full of water. You put in a handful of straw or hay. Put it out in the sun for a couple days and build up the populations of diatoms and algae in that bucket. That's what mosquito larvae eat, and that becomes an irresistible brew to female mosquitoes that want to lay their eggs. They will preferentially lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you get a sheet of mosquito dunks. That's Bacillus thuringiensis, a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera, and the only diptera in your bucket is a mosquito larva. It costs $12. $12 for a season's worth of control. It's targeted, it's cheap. You know, if a dragonfly gets in there, it's not going to hurt it a bit. If your dog drinks it, no problem. You might put a coarse screen over your bucket so a chipmunk doesn't commit suicide. But it's cheap, it's targeted, it works, particularly if everybody did it. But if you just want to enjoy your yard some Saturday afternoon and you don't want to kill anything, get a fan and turn it on and sit in the directed breeze. The mosquitoes will not fly into it. Very easy. All right, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows those caterpillars to complete their development. And I'm talking about how we landscape underneath our trees. This is just an example, but I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches, then it emerges as an adult, then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish everything did that, but most species don't. 94% of the caterpillars on that tree finish growing as caterpillars, and then they drop from the tree and wiggle their way beneath the soil surface and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree, and that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. It's messy. And we mow and compact the soil all around that tree so that it's rock hard and makes it very hard for those caterpillars to get underground and complete their development. These are oak trees here, and that makes it an ecological trap. They're calling in the adult moths to lay their eggs. The caterpillars grow, they drop down, and they die. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. I am convinced that the way we landscape under our trees is another major cause of insect declines around the country. Now, this is what most people do. You got a tree in a yard. And I've got a new grad student this year, Emma Jonas, who's measuring how well caterpillars do in a situation like this. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, a layered landscape. Soft landing. Maybe there's a dogwood up here and then native azaleas and ferns and ground cover. Caterpillar falls down. The ground is not compacted. Nobody's going to mow them. Nobody's going to step on them. They can easily get underground and spin their cocoons in the leaf litter that's there. Much higher survivorship. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral garden and put big beds around your trees. The bigger, the better. Your trees will love it, and so will the caterpillars. And that's how you shrink the lawn, folks. Just expand the beds around your trees, and all of a sudden you have less lawn. Use native ground covers like wild ginger. This is native pachysandra. There's the Virginia creeper as a nice lawn or ground cover. Golden seal, mayapples, foam flowers, ferns. If you can see the ground, you don't have enough plants under your trees. It's green mulch that the trees really want, and so do those caterpillars. Okay, a former grad student, Desiree Narango, did some great work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and her results suggest there's actually room for compromise in our plant choices, and that's good news. She had one simple question: how well do landscapes that are dominated by native plants support chickadee populations over time compared to landscapes that are dominated by introduced ornamentals? And when they're dominated by introduced ornamentals, they support 75% fewer caterpillars, which means you've reduced the amount of bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So everybody had a nest box up, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here, we're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to reach maturity. And if you put all that into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from non-native woody plant biomass, from 0 to 100%, this is what you get. The dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live that long. And if you reproduce at that rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population, and that's what happens when you have very few non-native plants, anything above the line there. But when you have a lot of native plants, you are making fewer babies than adults die, and you have an unsustainable shrinking population. Now, right there is where those lines intersect, very liberally speaking, which suggests you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying the local food web. Can't tolerate any invasives. No burning bush, no privet, no barberry, no calorie pear, because they're ecological tumors. They just escape and go crazy in our natural areas. But there are a lot of natives, or non-natives, that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman? That's a ginkgo tree, just like yours out front there. Why does Dan have a ginkgo in his native planting? Because Dan's wife liked ginkgos, and she said, I want one. So he put it in, but the point is that tree wrecking the ecological integrity of this landscape? No, it's just there. Is it going to escape and become an invasive species in the woodlot? No, it's just there. So I tend to think of plants that are just there as if they're statues. So there you go, there's Dan's statue. If all of Dan's plants were statues, he would not have a productive landscape. But it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of those high-contributing native plants. If we increase the percentage of them, we can tolerate the ones that are not contributing very much. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design taken from a drone 400 feet up. You do not get more formal than that, and every plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in Europe every day, and they love them over there. If they can love our native plants, we can love our native plants too. Can we get a pollinator garden into a suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells your neighbor it's not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's servicing a number of species of bees. It's not very big. It could be bigger. But if everybody did it, it would help. Help what? Help make pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? Well, the media was saved because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually about a 12th of our crops. And I hear people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Pollinators are more than just about humans, believe it or not. We need pollinators everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere, because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. How about this? This is a Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported over here in the lawn. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota's been doing it for several years now. They've got a cost-sharing program where the state helps homeowners financially reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very popular. Pennsylvania has a similar program now. It's not very well funded, so there's a big, long waiting list. There's an island off of Florida, I think it's Marco Island, that is paying homeowners to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it, rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on these invasive ornamentals like calorie pear. That's what St. Louis, Missouri did, and Fayetteville, Arkansas did. North Carolina's put a bounty on them. If you take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. Water utilities are giving people $100 coupons to plant water-efficient native plants, and of course the big lawn reduction programs in California. That's gone up. You get $3 per square foot. Every square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn you replace with a xeric planting. California does not have one drop of rain that it can waste on lawns. And if you want more information on all of those programs, memorize that. Okay, I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, and the first one's serious. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. We like it. We like to go bird watching. We like to just walk around or ride our bikes, but it's not essential. And if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, nature takes a back seat. And of course, resources are always in short supply, so nature's always taking a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo when before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-size poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save wildlife, want to save nature, so that future generations can enjoy it. It was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for expanding the national park system. Beautiful places, we want to save them so that future generations can enjoy it. And I get that, because nature is enormously entertaining. But it's much more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations, It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about that, but if we restrict conservation just to the areas where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those areas are too small, too isolated, and there's too few of them. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug, and that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance, and I don't like that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks. We've got to put the plants back. Not just to make biological corridors that connect isolated fragments with each other so that plants and animals can move back and forth, but to restore habitat viability in all those places where we've dismantled it. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship just to a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, since every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody share the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been very good at teaching everybody that we all have rights, but we've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. That does not mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. More and more people recognize that the planet has some serious issues right now, but they all feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can use keystone plants, one person can remove their invasive plants, one person can fire Mosquito Joe, one person can put in a pollinator garden, one person can modify their light system, one person can totally revitalize their little yard's ecosystem and then enhance the greater ecosystem in which they lie instead of continuing to degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy. Help a park or preserve. Help a church. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like that. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. So I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much. All right.
That's my husband, and he just said what I was going to say. Thank you for coming. Let's let Dr. Tallamy get to the book signing table, and then please enjoy the reception.